A lie can destroy a life in a matter of seconds, but sometimes the truth has the power to mobilize an entire army. Marcus Chen was leaning against the red brick wall of the grocery store when two officers approached, their boots striking the asphalt with the authority of men who had already decided the outcome of this encounter. The 47-year-old veteran held a lukewarm cup of coffee between his calloused hands, quietly observing the pace of a Tuesday morning in downtown Detroit, unaware that the next few minutes would not only change his life, but alter the entire dynamic of that busy street. His tired eyes reflected years of battles far beyond the war zones of Afghanistan, fought instead in the cold streets of a city that seemed to have forgotten its heroes. Officer Rodriguez was the first to speak, his sharp voice echoing between the buildings like a sentence already passed. "Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them," he ordered, one hand already resting on his holster, while his partner, Officer Thompson, took a strategic position on the other side. Marcus slowly raised his cup, confused, his movements deliberate and cautious, like someone who had learned to read body language as a matter of survival. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice hoarse yet respectful, maintaining the direct eye contact he had mastered during his 15 years serving in the Marines. The atmosphere on the street began to shift. Pedestrians slowed their steps, shopkeepers paused at their doors, everyone sensing that something was about to happen. The accusation struck like lightning from a clear sky, precise and devastating, like a poorly planned military operation. "We've had reports that you were harassing customers and aggressively asking for money," Rodriguez lied, his eyes avoiding Marcus's as he spun a narrative to justify what was about to unfold. Thompson nodded, reinforcing the fabricated story with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this routine many times before. Marcus felt the world tilt around him, the injustice cutting deeper than any battlefield wound he'd ever sustained. "That's not true," he replied, his voice trembling, not from fear but from a controlled rage bubbling beneath the surface. "I was just drinking my coffee, waiting for the library to open." But Marcus's words seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed by the officer's determination to follow a script that left no room for truth. Rodriguez had already drawn the handcuffs, the metal glinting under the morning sun like a grim omen. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall," he ordered, completely ignoring the veteran's explanation. The click of the cuffs echoed through the street like a gunshot, and Marcus felt the cold weight of the metal on his wrists, the same metal that once held medals for bravery. As he was pressed against the rough wall, his eyes locked onto a security camera, blinking silently atop the building across the street, unaware that this tiny device would be the key to a twist no one could have predicted. Public humiliation is a wound that bleeds in silence, and Marcus Chen was bleeding in front of a crowd that grew with every second. People gathered along the sidewalks like spectators at a macabre show, some whispering among themselves, others discreetly recording with their phones, witnessing what appeared to be just another routine arrest of a problematic homeless man. Thompson rifled through Marcus's few belongings with unnecessary force, scattering a worn-out wallet, some veteran medications, and a faded photograph of soldiers in combat uniforms onto the ground. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the officer mocked, holding up the photo as if it were criminal evidence without even glancing at the young, smiling faces that once risked their lives for the country. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling every second of this exposure like a betrayal of everything he had fought for. Rodriguez spoke into his radio, reporting an arrest for disturbing behavior and aggressive panhandling, his words transmitted to dispatch as if they were absolute truth. The crowd kept growing, and Marcus could feel the judgmental stares piercing his skin like bullets. A woman clutched her purse tightly, pulling her small son away as if Marcus were a deadly threat, while a man in a suit shook his head in disapproval. "These bums are taking over the city," someone murmured in the crowd, and Marcus felt his soul shatter just a little more. He had spent countless nights in trenches in Afghanistan, defending the very freedoms of the people, now looking at him as human garbage. The irony was as bitter as the taste of blood in his mouth. Blood from biting his tongue to avoid saying something that could worsen his situation. The sound of military boots hitting the pavement cut through the air like a familiar symphony, but with his face pressed to the rough wall, Marcus couldn't see where it was coming from. The steps were unlike those of the civilians around, precise, synchronized, bearing the weight of discipline only someone who had served could recognize. The crowd began to stir, whispers spreading like ripples as three young men in combat uniforms approached the scene. Rodriguez looked up, frowning at the sight of the soldiers drawing closer, his confidence faltering for the first time since the encounter began. "Stay back! This is a police matter!" he shouted, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that didn't go unnoticed. Thompson stopped rummaging through Marcus's things, his full attention now on the approaching figures marching with determined purpose. The tallest Marine, maybe 25 years old, his face marked by battle scars, stopped just a few feet from Marcus, his eyes widening in sudden recognition. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice laced with a reverence that instantly silenced the entire crowd. "Sergeant Chen?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to go off, and Marcus slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking with those of the young soldier. For a moment time stood still, and 2 decades of distance vanished in an instant. "Jackson?" Marcus murmured, recognizing the recruit he once trained, now a full-fledged Marine. The young soldier glanced at the cuffs, then at the officers, and something dangerous began to flicker in his eyes. "Officers," Jackson said, his voice low but full of authority, "you just handcuffed one of the greatest heroes this country has ever produced." Jackson's revelation hit the crowd like a fragmentation grenade, shattering every assumption that had formed in the last few minutes. Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged nervous glances, clearly not expecting their easy target to have military connections, let alone be recognized by active duty soldiers. "That doesn't change anything," Rodriguez tried to bluff, but his voice had lost all prior authority, sounding more like the desperate bark of a cornered dog. He was disturbing the peace and intimidating civilians. Jackson stepped forward, followed by the other 2 Marines, forming a defensive line that made the officers instinctively step back. "Sergeant Chen trained half the Marines currently deployed in the Middle East," Jackson declared, his voice echoing through the now silent street. "He saved my life in Kandahar, and you're treating him like a common criminal." The mood on the street shifted dramatically, as if a storm were approaching the horizon. Pedestrians who had once avoided Marcus now stepped closer, murmuring among themselves about the unexpected turn of events. Thompson began to sweat visibly, realizing the situation was slipping out of control, while Rodriguez spoke nervously into his radio, calling for backup. "It doesn't matter what he did in the past," the officer insisted, but his words sounded hollow, even to himself. "The law is the same for everyone." Jackson let out a bitter laugh, a sound that chilled everyone present. "The law? You fabricated a charge to arrest a man who was just drinking coffee." The second Marine, a burly man with tattoos on his arms, pulled out his phone and began recording, muttering about evidence and injustice. The crowd started to stir, some quietly applauding, others filming the escalating confrontation. The tension on the street had turned into a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding, and Marcus remained at the center of the storm, still handcuffed, watching his life being debated by strangers like an object at auction. The third Marine, a young Hispanic man with piercing eyes, stepped even closer to the officers, his military bearing intimidating even without weapons. "Do you know how many men Sergeant Chen brought back alive?" he asked, his voice sharp as a blade. 43. 43 families still have sons, husbands, fathers, because this man refused to leave anyone behind. Rodriguez swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the crowd's gaze, no longer seeing him as a protector of the law, but as an oppressor. Thompson tried to maintain composure, but his hands trembled visibly as he gripped the radio, waiting for backup that seemed to take an eternity to arrive. The crowd had transformed completely, from passive spectators to an engaged audience now questioning the official version of events. An elderly woman stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger at Rodriguez. "I was here when it all started," she declared with a steady voice. "That man wasn't bothering anyone. He was just sitting there quietly, drinking his coffee." Other voices joined the chorus. Witnesses who had seen the entire encounter from the beginning, each confirming Marcus's innocence and exposing the officer's lies. Jackson gave a bitter, satisfied smile, realizing that the truth was finally breaking through. "You all heard that?" he said, gesturing toward the witnesses. "Multiple people confirming that you lied." Udum. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, but it was unclear whether it was police backup or something else, and the uncertainty made every heartbeat in the crowd pound with anticipation. The sirens grew louder, like the roar of some ancient beast, and every eye on the street turned toward the horizon, expecting more police cars. But what appeared was something entirely unexpected. 3 military vehicles turned the corner in formation, followed by a van bearing the emblem of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and finally 2 police cruisers that looked almost insignificant compared to the convoy that preceded them. Jackson smiled as he recognized some of the uniformed passengers, Marines and soldiers who disembarked with the precision of a coordinated operation. "Looks like the cavalry's here," he muttered to his comrades, while Rodriguez and Thompson watched in growing horror as the situation spiraled completely out of their control. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes gleaming with a mix of surprise and emotion at the sight of so many military uniforms approaching, each one carrying the weight of an oath that transcended civilian boundaries. The first to step out of the lead vehicle was a middle-aged man with colonel patches on his uniform, followed by 2 younger officers and a civilian in a suit carrying a leather briefcase. The crowd instinctively parted, intimidated by the military presence, as the newcomers marched toward the center of the chaos with a determination that made the air vibrate with tension. "Officer Rodriguez," the colonel said, his voice laced with an authority that made the officer's words sound like the whispers of children. "I'm Colonel Matthews, U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Command. We've received reports that one of our veterans is being detained under questionable circumstances." The civilian beside the colonel opened his briefcase, revealing official documents that made Rodriguez swallow hard. "This is Military Attorney Thompson, and we have a few questions regarding the procedures followed during this detention." Military Attorney Thompson wasn't related to the officer of the same name, but the coincidence in their names caused a momentary confusion, one that quickly gave way to a powerful legal demonstration that left the 2 officers completely defenseless. "Colonel, allow me to present evidence that directly contradicts the initial report," the lawyer said, pulling out a tablet where a security recording was already playing. The camera from the building across the street had captured the entire sequence, showing Marcus sitting peacefully, drinking his coffee, with no interaction with passers-by and no threatening behavior. Rodriguez felt the blood drain from his face as his own lie was exposed in high definition, while Officer Thompson instinctively recoiled, as if the tablet screen were a weapon aimed at his face. "How do you explain this discrepancy between the verbal report and the visual evidence?" Colonel Matthews asked, his voice as sharp as a military sentence. The crowd pushed closer to see the footage, and a wave of outrage spread like wildfire when it became clear that the officers had fabricated the entire story. A journalist passing by recognized the gravity of the moment and began live streaming, narrating to her viewers the injustice unfolding in real time. "We are witnessing a clear case of police abuse against a war veteran," she reported, focusing her camera on Marcus, still handcuffed against the wall. Jackson and his fellow Marines closed in further around the officers, forming a protective semicircle around Marcus, their eyes burning with a controlled fury that promised consequences if the situation wasn't resolved immediately. The sound of more vehicles approaching echoed down the street, and this time there was no doubt. Something far bigger was about to unfold, something that would forever alter the course of that Tuesday morning in Detroit. What happened next transformed the narrative from a simple case of police injustice into a moment that would go down in American military history. Colonel Matthews stepped closer to Marcus, and when he saw the veteran's handcuffed face, his knees nearly buckled under the weight of recognition. "My God," he whispered, his voice thick with reverence that made the entire crowd fall instantly silent. "Sergeant Marcus Chen, Congressional Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars." Each word landed like a bomb in the crowd, and Rodriguez felt his world collapse around him as he realized he hadn't just arrested a random veteran, but one of the most decorated soldiers in recent U.S. history. Marcus lowered his head, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Jackson shouted with elation, "I told you you'd arrested a hero, but I had no idea it was the hero." The military attorney quickly accessed classified files on his tablet, revealing to the stunned crowd the true identity of the man who had just been humiliated in public. Marcus Chen led the operation that saved over 200 Afghan civilians from a terrorist attack in 2018, he declared, his voice echoing down the street like a sermon. He lost his left leg and suffered a traumatic brain injury protecting an orphanage. After 15 years of exemplary service, he developed PTSD and struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The crowd murmured in shock and shame, many who had silently judged Marcus now bowing their heads in guilt. Rodriguez desperately tried to remove the handcuffs, but his hands trembled so badly he couldn't find the key, while Officer Thompson began sweating profusely, realizing his career was likely over. "Gentlemen," said Colonel Matthews, his voice now laced with a cold fury that promised devastating consequences, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your professional lives." The revelation of Marcus's true identity turned the street into a psychological battlefield, where social hierarchies were instantly overturned. Jackson finally removed the handcuffs using his own emergency key, and when Marcus turned to face the crowd, everyone could see the scars that marked his face, like war maps few civilians could imagine. "Sergeant Chen," said Colonel Matthews, snapping a crisp salute that was immediately echoed by every military member present. "On behalf of the United States Armed Forces, I apologize for the humiliation you suffered today." Rodriguez and Thompson watched in absolute horror as one of the country's most decorated soldiers rubbed the red marks on his wrists. Knowing their careers weren't just over, they were likely facing criminal charges for falsifying reports and abusing their authority. The journalist live streaming the moment could barely contain the emotion in her voice as she narrated the epic turn of events. "We are standing before Marcus Chen, a man who sacrificed everything for his country and was treated like a common criminal by officers who clearly didn't do their homework," she reported, focusing on the tears streaming down the faces of several veterans in the crowd. More Marines and soldiers continued to arrive, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all alerted by the military communication network that had spread like a benevolent virus through Detroit's veteran community. The sound of helicopters began to rumble above the city, and it was unclear whether they belonged to the media or the military, but the tension in the air was thick, electric, like the moment before a storm. Marcus remained silent, his eyes scanning the scene with a mix of gratitude and melancholy, knowing that despite the recognition, thousands of other veterans faced the same social indifference every single day. The arrival of more veterans turned the street into an impromptu gathering of brothers in arms, each carrying their own invisible scars and a loyalty that transcended decades and personal differences. A grey-haired man in a wheelchair approached, removing his cap to reveal a scar running across half his skull. "Sergeant Chen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you carried me for 3 kilometers in Fallujah when I lost my legs. I never forgot." Other veterans stepped forward, each sharing how Marcus had impacted their lives, forming a human shield around the man who had been humiliated just 30 minutes earlier. Rodriguez and Thompson tried to slip away discreetly, but found themselves surrounded by a crowd that had no intention of letting them escape the consequences of their actions. The situation had grown far beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. with reporters arriving from all directions and high-ranking police officials rushing in to contain the fallout of a scandal going viral across social media. Colonel Matthews received a call on his military radio, and his expression grew even more serious, if that were possible. "Sergeant Chen," he said, approaching with respectful formality, "General Morrison is on his way from Washington to personally apologize for the treatment you've received." The crowd erupted into murmurs of awe and shock. It was unheard of for a general to travel personally to apologize to a veteran, but the gravity of the situation and Marcus's stature in the military community made the gesture not only appropriate, but necessary. Jackson looked at his fellow Marines, pride gleaming in his eyes, knowing they had done the right thing by standing up for their former instructor. The sound of sirens approached once again, this time bringing senior police officials and representatives from the city government, all scrambling to contain a crisis that had spiraled out of control and now threatened lasting political consequences. What happened in the following minutes would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary moments in modern American military history. A presidential convoy turned the corner, complete with security vehicles and Secret Service agents, causing the crowd to instinctively fall back in stunned silence. The President of the United States himself stepped out of the armored vehicle, walking directly toward Marcus with a determination that hushed the entire street. "Sergeant Chen," the President said, delivering a flawless military salute, "I received the report of what happened here today, and I came in person to apologize on behalf of a nation that has failed you." The crowd erupted in gasps of disbelief and emotion, phones recording the historic moment as Marcus, visibly moved, returned the salute with the precision of a soldier who had never forgotten his training. Rodriguez and Thompson were quietly escorted away by federal agents, their careers not just over, but their actions now under high-level government investigation. Marcus finally found his voice, his words heavy with decades of pain and sacrifice that were, at long last, being recognized. "Mr. President," he said, his voice trembling, "I did nothing more than my duty. There are thousands of veterans on the streets who deserve the same attention I'm receiving today." The President smiled, placing a respectful hand on the veteran's shoulder, and announced something that would go down in history. "That's exactly why I'm signing an executive order today to create the Marcus Chen Veterans Assistance Program, ensuring that no American hero is ever treated the way you were today." Oh, the crowd exploded in thunderous applause, tears streaming down the faces of civilians and servicemen alike as Jackson and his fellow Marines embraced, knowing they had not only witnessed their mentor's redemption, but the birth of a movement that would save thousands of veterans' lives. The Detroit sun shone brighter in that moment, illuminating a street that had become the epicenter of a silent revolution, where truth triumphed over injustice and a broken man rose to become a symbol of hope for an entire nation.